fought against fanaticism, albeit in the 18th century. And I took a little heart from that, and when I came to writing down my thoughts, it was at the end of March, and that was at a time when a preacher in Florida decided to burn the Quran because it was a wicked book. And in response to that, in Mazar-i-Sharif in Afghanistan, 7 United Nations workers were dragged out by the crowd and killed, 2 of them by decapitation. Now, this illustrates how easy and how difficult it is to talk about fanaticism, because I think we're all pretty much agreed on the fact that this is a bad thing. And if I stand here saying fanaticism is not a good thing, then this talk is going to be very short. But I think what interests me more, and what interested the philosophers, these radical Enlightenment philosophers more, was the point at which fanaticism can begin. Because fanaticism is, in a way, a refusal to listen. A refusal to listen to argument. Fanaticism comes into being if I no longer am open to your arguments about something, to your other view about something. And it so happens that there is a point in the lives of all of us when we simply have to say, I believe. I believe, and I think that applies to all of us in this room, in the importance of individual human rights, in the human rights of the individual. Now, this is such a platitude in our societies that it really hardly bears mentioning, but it also makes us forget that this is a cultural intuition that is not shared by all cultures around the world. And cultures that do not share it, for instance, Confucian societies, where the harmony of the whole is much more important than the rights of the individual, are excellently run and very successful societies. And as it happens, you can't actually philosophically argue, prove that the rights of the individual are more important than the harmony of the whole. This is a cultural intuition of us in the West, and it is no longer, in our case, I think, open to argument. There we simply say, I believe. And I think that is an important point, because a fanatic, the word comes from fane, a Roman temple, and it is simply the follower of such a temple. So in a way, a fanatic always deals with what is sacred to him or her. And there is a point in all of our lives when we have things that are simply sacred to us. They may not be in a religious context, but there are things that we are not willing to discuss or to put up for discussion. And I think that is where things become interesting, because if we go the classic fanatic way, at this moment when we are no longer open for discussion, we can shut off altogether, and we can paint the world in the Manichaean colors of white and black, and we can speak of us and them, and we can simply say, who does not agree with us is evil. It is no longer a question of rational discourse, but it is a question of good and evil. Now, the Enlightenment tried to fight this tendency, and I would like to run 2 strategies by you, which I think may cast this into a stronger light. The first of all would be to say, well, if you haven't got your story right, you'd better start differentiating more effectively between fact and fiction. You may believe something very strongly, but it may not accord with the facts. So distinguish between facts and fiction, and then your thinking will be much cleaner. The problem is that it is impossible to distinguish between fact and fiction. In our societies, our social facts have been made up by social and cultural fictions. Think of the great myths, think of Christianity. They have shaped reality. They have shaped, for instance, our laws, and our laws result in very real occurrences. So myths have shaped facts, but at the same time, these facts have become parts of fictions. You can no longer tell the 2 apart. So telling someone to get his story straight, to separate fact from fiction, is not actually possible. What I think is a more promising approach is the fact that these myths on which our societies rest, these stories which our societies tell about themselves, and these stories which individuals tell about themselves, they perform a very important function in our lives, because in a way they take the cultural intuitions that we have, the cultural reflexes, and they dramatize them, they give them a dramatic arch, they project them out into the world. Through a story you can learn how to turn your instinct into an act. And stories give you a way of living in the world, a way of acting in the world. You will have already known certain situations because you have already encountered it in stories. That, incidentally, is why children need to have stories told to them over and over again. They still have to learn those patterns of behavior, those patterns of thinking, and even of feeling. So I think it becomes clear that if stories are the way that we plot a way through the bewildering experience that we have, because don't forget, our experience as we have it in our lives is not logical. It is essentially chaotic. We see in our lives around ourselves that people who try very hard and who are wonderful people get terribly ill and die, and people who are obviously wicked obviously live to a happy old age. We see that good efforts are frustrated, and none of these things make sense. They are chaotic and they're infinitely frustrating. I think this is at the point at which we need stories for our very survival. We need it for our psychological survival. We need the hope, the necessary fiction of a story, that if you cast this arch into the world, there good people are rewarded, there the wicked are damned, there things have a beginning, a middle and an end, they have a definite goal. So I think stories are very important, and that leads me to suspect perhaps what is important in discussing even fanaticism is how we deal with these stories, how we deal with these necessary stories. Because stories are in a way only a way of connecting facts. If you took a piece of string and you tied it to certain facts and not to others, and you plot a way through those facts, other people may plot a different way. And let me illustrate that through my, well, the favorite friendship I have at the moment to talk about, and that is the friendship between two philosophers who are long dead, but very much alive to me, and I hope a little more alive to you at the end of the evening. One of them is known as a great philosopher, the other is known as a minor novelist, and I think he was much the greater philosopher. The minor novelist in question is Denis Diderot. The great philosopher in question is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And what fascinates me about those two is, first of all, that they grew up almost like brothers. They had never met, but they were born only a year apart, in 1712 and 1713 respectively. They both came from very proud provincial cities, Langres in the Champagne and Geneva. They both had fathers who were craftsmen and very proud and very strict with them. And they both basically ran away from home at the age of 15 to discover the world. And they both were very much exercised by religious questions. When Rousseau left Geneva at the age of 15, he had nothing more pressing to do than convert to Catholicism. When the 15-year-old Denis Diderot turned up in Paris, he wore a tonsure like a monk, and he was called Abbé Diderot, and he wanted to become a Jesuit priest. The two met as young men and began discussing their common passions for music, for drama, but also for religion. And at this point, their paths began to diverge in a way that would lead to a spectacular falling out that is wonderful to read about, but far too detailed to tell you this evening. But I think it is important to see why they fell out. And I think that that sheds light on the question that we have before us tonight. Rousseau found that Rousseau was involved in the scientific thinking of his time, and he found that the scientific thinking of the time suggested that life was basically meaningless and we were a species of apes. And so he rejected it. And he wrote to Voltaire, "I have suffered too much in this world not to believe in another one. I feel it, I believe in it, I want it, and I hope for it." Now, to my mind, there is no better definition of the mind of a fanatic than that. Namely, that you base your feelings, that you base your opinions on your feelings, and that you base your opinions on your will. Diderot dealt differently with the same question. He also had a nostalgia to believe. He also wanted to believe in a great God and a religion, but his reason told him that he couldn't, that he mustn't, because it is false, because it doesn't make sense. And that he was left with this need he could not satisfy. Now, what makes Diderot the more interesting philosopher for me was that he understood this need as a psychological phenomenon. Something in him that did not actually signify anything outside of him. Much in the same way as if he wanted to sleep with someone, and he could not do that for certain reasons. The simple fact that as a grown-up, we cannot satisfy all our desires. So his desire to believe, to be submerged in a great story, he saw as something that he had to learn to deal with psychologically. And he did that. He did that in his novels, he did that in his plays. They always come back to this point. Let me try to use this example to come back to fanaticism, to the fact that on the one hand you can choose to believe something to the exclusion of all arguments to the contrary, and you can declare these arguments to the contrary, as Rousseau did, as wicked. And he went as far as to say in an ideal society, people who say the contrary of what I am saying should be executed. Or you can deal with it as Diderot did, which is to say, I have a strong interior longing for something, but I must treat this longing as a psychological fact within me that I have to learn to live with, to manage. We were speaking, or I was speaking earlier about stories and how important they are to us. Now, Diderot and Rousseau were both creating stories about themselves. Rousseau, a story of religious truth, and a truth very much with a capital T. And Diderot actually wrote these stories out in novels and acted out the difficulties, acted out the different voices almost in his head. And if stories are so important to us, there's one formulation, one sentence that has helped me infinitely to understand this, and this is by the English poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who said that what we really need to understand poetry, that was his business, is a willing suspension of disbelief. Now that's a rather wonderful idea. In a way it is giving skepticism a rest for a moment, a suspension of disbelief. And it is true, if we want to engage with a story, be it a film or a novel or somebody's account, we must suspend our disbelief for a moment. We must accept that there was this woman called Emma Bovary who had an affair. If we start with the idea she's only fictional and none of this ever happened, we won't get very far with this novel. On the other hand, we must suffer with Othello when he finds, or thinks he finds, his wife unfaithful. But you know the famous story in the Wild West when a cowboy got up to his feet and shot Othello because he had just strangled Desdemona on stage. Now, this man was clearly not able to distinguish between fact and fiction very much. But this is the fact that even when Desdemona lies there dead, we have to remember the fellow on stage hasn't actually just killed a woman. And the woman who's lying there so impressively dead is actually perfectly well. But we find ourselves in a sort of schizophrenic stage between belief and unbelief. Very much the same stage, and I come back to it, that children have when they listen to stories. they know every word of the story and they will angrily correct you if you use a single word differently, but they relive the story all over again. It has a great place in their lives, but as they get older, more and more, they build up the wall between fact and fiction. They believe less that the people in the stories they hear about actually exist. But they can actually already manage this schizophrenic balancing act between allowing yourself the suspension of disbelief without becoming a true believer. And I think that's where an important reaction to fanaticism, or perhaps an insurance against fanaticism, must lie. Diderot taught us that we have to learn to think against our instincts. If we have an instinct to seek for the great meaning, to seek for the great story that embraces everything, we must not give in to this instinct. We must learn to think against what we want to be true most. And now, this evening stands under the motto of "We are all fanatics," and that I think is a bit in danger of being just a bon mot that you smile about and you think, oh yes, well, I've also. But I think actually it is important to take it more seriously, and I come back to Rousseau because I talked about those cultural reflexes that we have that are simply beyond argument. Now today we hold our societies to be enlightened societies that are very much in the heritage of people like Diderot and Immanuel Kant and Voltaire and so on. I personally believe that this belief in the Enlightenment doesn't go very far. First of all, the Enlightenment took a terrible knock after the Second World War, because people like Adorno decided that a concentration camp commander who reads Rilke and plays Bach is the living antithesis of the Enlightenment, and that must mean that all the values of the Enlightenment are foul. And secondly, I think we have become so rich that the values that were fought for in the 18th century simply no longer seem very important to us. But look for a moment at the society around us, and you will find that the structures of our thinking, the structures of our public discourse are actually not created and formed by the Enlightenment, but basically by theology. And I think that is where Rousseau has a very important part to play. Rousseau's philosophy allowed it to people to think in a Christian theological way without being Christians or knowing theology. Rousseau was deeply ambivalent to women. Rousseau was deeply ambivalent to sexuality. Rousseau deeply wanted another life. In many ways, these are things that theologians have preached for centuries. And if you look, for instance, today at the most prevalent, most powerful form of storytelling we have in our civilization, Hollywood movies, it is thought obscene to see the sight of a naked human body. It is not thought obscene to see someone tortured to death. That, to me, is Christian hatred of the body in its purest form. If you look at how we see the future, you will find that the press, but also we privately, always think in terms of paradise and apocalypse. We never presume that the future will mean a gradual muddling through over the centuries. We always look for the big one. That too is a religious way of thinking. Think of the debates about cloning, about assisted dying, about birth control. Wherever you look, you will find deep-rooted theological thinking. Now, these cultural reflexes that our European and Western societies are very much still built upon are no longer thought to be such. They are just how we do things. They are no longer thought to be Christian, but they are deeply Christian. And I think we haven't had too little enlightenment. We haven't had too much enlightenment. We have had far too little. Because it is of course, everybody's choice whether he or she wants to be religious. But what we are talking about is public debates which are religious without anybody noticing it. And I think that is the moment where we are all fanatics without knowing it, because we all adhere to cultural reflexes that are beyond argument and that are based on a theological paradigm that we no longer even recognize. I think that at that moment we need more enlightenment. And I want to close this rather wild gallop through a few thoughts with an idea, namely that I have quite an eccentric idea, namely that migration in Europe that is creating social problems at the moment, migration in Europe that is giving right-wing parties everywhere in Europe, particularly in this country I'm standing now, and particularly in the country I'm living in, such huge new numbers. Migration is actually our big chance, because we now have people in our societies who are citizens of our countries who do not share these cultural reflexes. They have other cultural reflexes. They come out of societies that have other cultural reflexes and intuitions. And if we want to build a society with them together, we must go beyond our and beyond their reflective or reflexive responses to things, and we must perhaps find something that is based more on a common humanity than on a religious history of this group or that. Every philosophy student learns in the first philosophy lesson that you must learn to ask the right questions, that if you don't learn to ask the right questions, you will always end up with the wrong answers. But nobody tells philosophy students, as far as I know, that you also must learn to live with the answers that you come to when you think. That, I think, is a much harder thing. The first is a technical issue. You can learn how to ask questions well. The second is an issue of huge personal discipline and exertion, to question yourself regularly, to question things around you, and to question what seems most natural in our societies. I think living with the answers that we come to is the great challenge that our societies face, that we face personally. It's a little bit, you know, this book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Well, this is Zen and the Art of Mental Maintenance. I think we haven't had too much enlightenment. I think we've had far too little, and perhaps it's time to revive this and to find some way of going forward that gets our rather tired European societies into a new and newly vital stage. Thank you very much.